Great. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I am Lucia von Reusner, a campaign director with Mighty Earth and your moderator for today. We hope you all managed to get outside and enjoy some nature in honor of Earth Day yesterday. COVID-19 has forced all of us indoors and given us time to reflect on how precious good health is and how interconnected our health is to the health of our surrounding environments. Indeed, for many of us, going out into nature has been a huge and sometimes only source of solace and healing during this quarantine. And the fact that we look to nature for healing is no coincidence. Global attention has been rightly focused on COVID-19 as the immediate risk to human health. But the reality is that COVID-19 is a symptom that arose from a set of underlying planetary health issues that need to be addressed in order to treat and prevent future outbreaks. Our goal in today's webinar is to highlight these connections and discuss why protecting forests, considered the lungs and the immune system of our planet, is critical for both mitigating the harm of the current pandemic and preventing future pandemics from emerging. Indeed, deforestation has been linked to around 30% of outbreaks of new and emerging diseases like Zika, Ebola, and COVID-19, and the haze that comes from burning forests for agriculture each summer is going to further exacerbate the respiratory risks and death from COVID-19. We have an incredible set of speakers for you today who will discuss the links between deforestation and pandemics, the value of nature-based solutions in preventing future pandemics, and the opportunities for the private sector and regulatory agencies to drive ambitious action to protect forests in 2020. Our first speaker is Amy Vitter, an epidemiologist at University of Florida's Emerging Pathogens Institute, where she studies the interface between vector-borne disease and land use change, and is also seeing COVID-19 patients. She has an MD and PhD from Stanford and Johns Hopkins, and her research has focused specifically on the links between tropical deforestation and vector-borne diseases. We will then hear from Glenn Horowitz, an accomplished environmental campaigner with a long track record of leading global campaigns to protect forests and current CEO of Mighty Earth. He will highlight for us the key drivers of deforestation, the industries most responsible, and the opportunities that exist in 2020 to drive ambitious action. We will then hear from Hannah Mowat, another incredibly experienced environmental campaigner who currently works for FERN, a leading EU-based environmental organization that has worked for 25 years to protect forests and the rights of people who depend on them. Hannah will provide us with an overview of efforts underway in the EU to make 2020 a critical year of action for protecting forests. We will then bring all the speakers together to provide any final comments and open it up for questions from the audience. So with that, I will now hand it over to Amy.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor.
Amy, I think you might be on mute.
Oh.
Okay, great.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. So I will talk briefly about the links between deforestation and epidemics, pandemics, outbreaks, and the such. The topic is very vast, but in broad strokes, it can be boiled down to a couple points. Vector-borne diseases, so diseases that are transmitted by mosquitoes, sandflies, ticks, those kinds of arthropods, they're on the whole, they increase following deforestation. Further, zoonoses, so those diseases that are normally contained within wildlife but jump over to humans, these have been emerging at the interface of forest and human settlements. And furthermore, people, especially indigenous people living in or near tropical forests, face a rise in non-communicable diseases and a loss of culture and livelihood as well. And in an unfortunate amplifying feedback loop, deforestation contributes to climate change, which in turn contributes to deforestation as well. And a lot of this generates haze, and that has associated health risks. And practically speaking, a loss of biodiversity has real tangible consequences for the loss of therapeutic options, And it also may lead to a concentration of disease-transmitting organisms. So I'll go into these things in a little more detail right now. In particular, vector-borne diseases contribute, or they are increased by deforestation, primarily mediated by changes in habitat. And so deforestation causes tremendous changes on the ground. And in particular, for example, aquatic habitats that mosquitoes may use to breed, these may be increased by deforestation as streams are blocked. Further rises in temperature, humidity, light, all these changes lead to changes in predators and parasite species and their abundances. All this has implications for mosquito species assemblages, and not just mosquitoes once again, but also ticks and sandflies. And if these conditions ultimately favor competent vectors of disease, then we see a rise in concomitant disease risk. We studied this, a colleague of mine, across the globe, looking at different studies that detail different mosquito species, vectors and non-vectors alike. And what you're looking at here is essentially a compilation showing to the right these groups right here are mosquitoes that favor deforested habitats, whereas the lower group favored pristine forest habitats. And what we found is that while there's a roughly equal spread of species in forested and deforested habitats, if you look at those in the deforested regions, they have a real preponderance of species that are competent vectors. Those are in the pink and the red. These are species that can vector one or more human pathogens. So the net effect essentially of deforestation favors mosquitoes that serve as vectors of human disease. And on the ground, this is what it looks like. This was from my site in Peru in the Amazon, and looking at forest streams, we found essentially no breeding of Anopheles darlingii, which is the main malaria parasite. Then in deforested shrub type habitat, we started to see the breeding of and the biting of this particular species, denoted in the red over here in the pie chart. And then in areas that were more deforested with villages, it was the majority of biting mosquitoes at nighttime, this malaria vector. So that's one example. Another example are zoonoses. And zoonoses essentially are impacted by deforestation, mainly because of human encroachment on habitat. And so this increased contact essentially can lead eventually to the pathogen adapting from wildlife into humans. And then that low-level transmission may actually jump into the larger community of humans and then eventually throughout the larger nation, and then possibly internationally. And we've had numerous examples of this. So one example, for example, may be Ebola. Now the jury's not out on this one. Nonetheless, Ebola seems to be harbored by numerous types of wildlife, primates, but also bats. For example, these are bats that were hunted for food in West Africa. Furthermore, bats were actually known to harbor RNA that was very similar to the Ebola Zaire strain in recent years. A study then looked at how forests and forest fragmentation in particular impacted the outbreak of Ebola in various sites within Central and West Africa. And they found that while forest cover was actually highly associated with Ebola, it was really fragmented forest cover that led to possibly these outbreaks to occur in combination with population density. Another example that is close to home for everyone these days is the coronavirus. Now, this current coronavirus outbreak, I must stress, we don't know how it's related to deforestation, if at all. However, we have a couple examples of clear zoonoses that occurred in very similar circumstances. So one was a SARS-CoV outbreak, and another was the MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory virus outbreak. Both of these are coronaviruses that originally were harbored in bats. And these bats, now bats are very interesting. They have a different immune system than we do, and they tend to harbor viruses for prolonged periods of time. They harbor a lot of coronaviruses, as it turns out, as well as many other RNA viruses. Now, bats don't necessarily come into direct contact with humans, but they do come into contact with the various pets that we may have, the livestock that we carry, and thereby essentially transmit to humans. So we'd be remiss to forget the people, the 200 million or so indigenous people who live near and in intact forests and depend on forests for their livelihood. These folks are impacted as well by non-communicable diseases, including, for example, obesity and diabetes. In the red, you see circled the groups that are primarily urbanized in a study that was done in Malaysia, compared to those who were mostly still in the forest, and the rates of obesity and diabetes are dramatically different. So in sum, there are various mechanisms by which forests reduce human disease. One of them can be kind of categorized as biodiversity. And some of what I was just talking about, the zoonoses, the vector-borne disease, there may be examples of this diversity stability hypothesis. It's a hypothesis that posits that a high amount of diversity actually reduces the impact of disturbance. It absorbs the shock. And so there are indeed a lot of viruses that are contained within forests, without doubt. But those viruses are maintained in these very intact loops that don't involve humans by far and large. However, once we start degrading that system, those viruses can then leave that intact loop. Another interesting theory is that of dilution effect. And this is a hypothesis in which community diversity actually modulates infection levels, and it does so by supporting a greater fraction of low competency hosts. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. And very straightforwardly, also, the forest and biodiversity is a vast source of therapeutics. Another major benefit of forests is that it regulates climate and water cycles. And so with regards to climate, it maintains regional climate, prevents desertification and flooding, and also serves as a carbon sink. And that, of course, has major implications for climate change, which in turn is associated with a lot of human disease. Then very, again, straightforwardly, it also serves as a physical barrier between amplifying hosts, vectors, and humans. So about biodiversity then, a little bit more on the dilution effect, a fascinating theory, not fully proven yet, but this paper actually looked at 200 studies that across the globe where they looked at the impact of diversity on a parasite or pathogen load of that system. And what you're looking at here essentially is that the effect of diversity negatively impacts the abundance of parasites, meaning pathogens. And that one was across the board. So that was for all the pathogens that they looked at, but also when they broke it down into wildlife pathogens, human pathogens, those with complex systems, and those with very simple transmission dynamics. So this was very compelling evidence of biodiversity actually protecting against disease. Then furthermore, with regards to therapeutics, we see here on this bar graph that especially Africa and South America, which have much diversity and thereby also a lot of plant species, are at great risk also of losing a lot of medicinal plant species. And a couple very interesting links are medicines that we use very commonplace in our medical practice. Captopril, for example, comes from the fer de lance snake. Vincristine is a chemotherapeutic agent. Captopril was actually a blood pressure medication. Vincristine is a chemotherapeutic agent that comes from the Madagascar periwinkle from the forest there. Then vancomycin, a drug I use every day so many times for various infections, comes from the bacteria Streptomyces orientalis, which came actually out of Borneo's forest in 1953. So I think that we are yet to tap into the vast potential of medicinal plant species. Then with regards to climate and the service that forests provide there, like I just mentioned, there's an amplifying feedback loop, unfortunately, with forest fires and deforestation leading to haze and more carbon emission. This results in decreased ability to absorb carbon dioxide, hotter dry seasons, and increased flammability of the forest, which then leads to more deforestation and forest fires. Greenhouse emissions that are attributable to agriculture, forestry, and land use comprise about 24% actually of all greenhouse gas emissions according to the IPCC 2014 report. This is probably more by now. So in terms of health and disease, how does this impact things? Well, there's a very interesting phenomenon that occurred in 1997 when there was a tremendous burning of forests. Actually, this was primarily in Southeast Asia for the plantations of palm oil. And this burning went out of control because of a particularly dry year and resulted in this haze that lingered. That haze was directly responsible for a 30 to 50% increase in clinic visits for haze-related conditions. So that included asthma, rhinitis, upper respiratory tract illnesses. And actually around the globe, it's been associated also with lung cancers and more serious conditions. But unfortunately, a lot of local study of this topic, including the Amazon, is very limited to date. It didn't end there though. So very interestingly, this haze led to the migration of flying foxes that normally dwell in Kalimantan, Borneo, these regions. And they no longer had food for foraging, the fruit that they rely upon because of the deforestation, haze, and drought. Devastated their habitat. That migration actually went up to Malaysia and brought the bat together with orchards. And these orchards happened to be next to pigsties and pig farms. The bats brought with them a novel virus named Nipah virus. The Nipah virus then got into the pigs, and the pigs transmitted it further to humans. Nipah virus has a mortality rate of about 70% or so in humans. So it was very devastating, and it still circulates to this day. So in sum, those are some of the ways in which forests really provide tremendous services in preventing us from getting diseases in broad strokes, admittedly. So biodiversity and climate change mitigate these in direct and indirect ways. I tend to wonder if we should add another category of disease emergence mitigation as a forest service. So with that, I will pass it on to Glenn. Thank you all so much for your attention and your participation today.
Thank you, Amy. That was wonderful and very insightful. We will now pass it, on to Glenn.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy and Lucia, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Let me just start by saying, we've all seen the pictures of bears frolicking in national parks, and I know I'm enjoying the clean air that comes with less traffic. But these silver linings are flecked with particles of soot in some parts of the world. And let me just show a slide here to illustrate what I'm talking about. As you can see, hopefully it's coming up. Okay. We've seen increases in deforestation in recent months in the Amazon in particular. And that is, deeply concerning. And it's also a direct result of some reductions in enforcement that we've seen in the Amazon. Just in the last couple of weeks, Ebola had been stepping up enforcement out of concern that agricultural interests and illegal loggers and miners were taking advantage of reduced enforcement to drive increases in deforestation. In response, we just got news in the last week or so that the head of the Ebola Enforcement Agency was fired because of the increase in enforcement. And so that's the dynamic in Brazil right now. And what you're seeing as a result is this increase in deforestation. And it's not, we've seen similar dynamics, not just there, but also in critical places like Indonesia. Some of this is a result of rollbacks that have previously occurred. So in 2019, unfortunately, the Jokowi government, which in some other areas has increased protections, took the very self-defeating step of allowing destruction of peat, repealing previous strong protections. But under the cover of crisis, the Indonesian government under President Jokowi has advanced what is perhaps the most self-defeating example of exploiting the coronavirus with its cynical efforts to enact previously existing anti-environment agendas of the logging industry. And they used coronavirus to justify eliminating legality certification requirements. We chronicled a lot of this in our report, The Coronavirus Profiteers, which is available on our website at mightyearth.org. I say it's self-defeating because it could mean a return to the bad old days of rampant illegal logging across Indonesia. And while it was meant to benefit the logging industry, it's actually likely to sabotage it. Indonesia had made great strides in improving its market access because it had finally developed a reputation for having a legal forest sector. And Europe's permission for Indonesian logs to enter the continent was dependent on this system. And now that it's in peril, so will Indonesia's access. Similarly, China is actually set to implement a very similar system starting in July, and the logging industry had been hopeful that they would be able to access it. But with the repeal of this regulation, it could go backwards. So, I just want to say there are real world consequences to these fires. And we've, already, just from coronavirus, you heard some of the numbers and the risks that Amy outlined. But in the US alone, 50,000 dead, 186,000 globally, 26 million people unemployed in just 5 weeks. But we've seen similar impacts, or even from environmental risks related to deforestation. In 2015, there were approximately 100,000 lives cut short as a result of the haze in Southeast Asia from deforestation related primarily to the pulp and paper and palm oil industries. And it has this, and already this year, we're seeing in Indonesia alone, more than 20,000 acres have burned. And that has respiratory impacts directly, but as we've heard, respiratory disease can make people more vulnerable to, or haze can make people more vulnerable to respiratory diseases like coronavirus. And it has a huge climate impact too. The world's forests contain more carbon than all the exploitable reserves of oil and coal. And so, from a climate perspective, this is also critical. This is not the crisis that people are most focused on right now, but is perhaps the crisis of our generation. So what to do? As our ally, Sierra Fitra of Origa in Indonesia said, forest fires can't be extinguished by Zoom. And the reality is that governments are not doing their jobs. And so that is, part of what we are seeing and what we're trying to address. It is shameful that the Bolsonaro government has weakened environmental enforcement in the same way that we've seen environmental enforcement weakened by the Trump administration here in the United States. But as this crisis shows, we simply can't wait for governments to do their basic duties. Government may not be doing its job, but the job still has to be done. And citizens are looking for solutions. One of the things that we found in our work at Mighty Earth is that it's a relatively small handful of companies that are responsible for an outsized amount of deforestation. We did analysis in 2017 showing on the animal feed industry in South America, showing that in the Cerrado in Brazil, for instance, it was almost entirely the Cargill and Bunge who were building infrastructure in the forest frontier, bringing roads in, financing farmers, and that was what was causing the deforestation. And so it's not, a problem in general, but what this means is that because there's a few companies responsible, we can take action. And similarly, during the Amazon fires last year, as the slide shows, we mapped where the fires were happening and how it overlay with infrastructure. And let me just stop share because I'm, hopefully the share is, are you guys able to see the slides now? So this was the map that we had done and of the slaughterhouse. And you can see there was a very strong correlation between presence of a handful of companies, namely JBS and cattle, Cargill, Bunge, and soy, both in Brazil and also in other areas. And so we have zeroed in on this, especially in an era when government is not doing its job. And we've tried to focus on companies that have previously committed to action. So back in 2010, the Consumer Goods Forum announced a commitment to end deforestation by 2020. Here are some of the companies that are members of it. And unfortunately, there's been very little action to do it. There's been a lot of commitments, a lot of polite asks, but when it has come to actually shifting supply chains, ceasing purchases from companies like Cargill and Bunge that have persistently engaged in deforestation, that has not changed. There's been a couple of exceptions recently. So Nestle, in the end of December, announced that they would stop buying soybeans from Cargill because of their ongoing deforestation from Brazil. And we've seen some companies in the fashion industry cease purchases from Brazil overall. But for the most part, these companies have continued to purchase from some of the worst drivers of deforestation. And so what we are trying to do right now is encourage consumers to say that that's not acceptable, that we can't rely just on polite asks, that there has to be commercial action. And that's what we're doing. I will say I want to give some credit where credit is due. We have seen companies act even in the midst of the coronavirus crisis in other commodities. So in palm oil, we've seen companies that may be imperfect, but are responding to alerts we file. So we've seen Wilmar, Louis Dreyfus, ADM, Bunge, and even Cargill drop the notorious deforester Samling in response to deforestation that they've conducted in Sarawak. And we just heard this morning from Mars, Unilever, and Hershey that they too have suspended them. There's a lot more to do there, but I think it is true that some companies are not just making cynical excuses, but are at least continuing their sustainability programs. And that is what we need more of. And that's what we're going to be trying to continue to drive. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Glenn. That was also very informative. As folks know, you can also type in Q&As as we're going along, and we'll answer those at the end. But if questions pop to your mind, feel free to write into the question answer box. And now I will pass it on to Hannah for our next speaker. Oh, and I was also reminded to let everyone know that we will be tweeting at Stand Mighty using the hashtag Protect Forests. So if there's anything out of these presentations that you want to share with your audiences that you found particularly provocative or informative, please do share and use the hashtag Protect Forests.
Great,
Hannah,
thanks a lot, Lucia. Thanks a lot, Lucia, and thanks a lot to Maria for inviting me, and thanks also to Amy for all the excellent work you're doing. So I've been asked to just say a few words about what is on the horizon in terms of EU supply chain regulation and what it would do to discriminate products on the basis of their impact on deforestation. Just a quick word on FUN. FUN is an organization based in Brussels. We've got offices also in Paris and the UK, and we specialize in ensuring that EU policies do not have a negative impact on forests and forest people's rights. I think it goes without saying that one of the reasons why we're also focusing on the EU is because the EU is a major market. In fact, it's the major market. It's the biggest trade bloc in the world. And that's sort of significant to mention at this stage, because when the EU decides to do something or bring in conditionalities into its market, it does send very strong market signals that hopefully also not only impact those who are exporting to the EU, but also other major importing markets like China and the US. It's a market that currently doesn't discriminate on the basis of deforestation, but it is quite a scrupulous market, and it does discriminate on the basis of quite a few other things, mainly on the basis of health and safety. So I just have a couple of slides, which are now not working. Oh yes, here we go. So due to a quite intense NGO campaign around 2012, 2013, the EU decided to map its deforestation footprint and found that it was very large, in fact, the second largest deforestation footprint in the world. And if you count the fact that there are loads less Europeans than Chinese, it actually has by far the largest per capita deforestation footprint in the world. Mainly for meat production, and mainly imported by 5. So on the left-hand side, you have the original study from the EU, which mapped the amount of deforestation that is being imported through internationally traded goods into the EU. And on the top right-hand side, you have some figures from a report that we did together with Earthsight based on 2012 figures, and it shows that there are 5 main member states which are importing deforestation products into the EU: Italy, Germany, Netherlands, France, and the UK. And you see at the top in terms of the colors what the products are that they mainly import. The EU has in the past, so I said that the EU doesn't discriminate on the basis of deforestation currently on its market, but it has been shown itself willing to discriminate on the basis of other sort of global environmental ills. For example, the Renewable Energy Directive, the latest iteration of which has decided to slowly phase out subsidies to palm oil on the basis of its deforestation impact. The EU timber regulation, which only allows timber that is legal to be put on the EU market. the illegal fishing regulation, which similarly only permits fish that is being legally fished to be placed in the EU market. The conflict minerals regulation, the sustainable finance regulation. So the EU does have a history and a track record of being willing to regulate on the basis of environmental and human rights causes. And it's, again, thanks to quite an intense NGO campaign that FIRM was part of, and so is Mighty Earth, it agreed to integrate or to consider new regulation on supply chains to ensure that goods placed on the EU market do not drive deforestation. So last July it issued a white paper on this matter, and then it took a step further in December of last year when it issued the European Green Deal, which was sort of the manifesto for the next 5 years for the EU in terms of what it's going to do on the environmental agenda, where it said that it will take measures, both regulatory and otherwise, to promote imported products and value chains that don't involve deforestation and forest degradation. That's significant because, as I said, the European Green Deal is very much, the manifesto for what the EU will do in the next 5 years. Of course, in the meantime, the coronavirus happened, which is why we're all sitting on this on this webinar. So I think it's significant to note that the Roadmap for Recovery, which was a document put together by the European Council, issued 2 days ago, stated that the European Green Deal will continue to be an essential element of an inclusive growth strategy going forward, and a recovery package. It's also significant to state that there are several very high-placed figures within the European institutions. Here is just one example: Christine Lagarde, who's head of the European Central Bank, who said a couple of weeks ago, well, I mean, you can read the quote there, but essentially she made the link between destruction of natural habitats and the pandemic that we were facing. So though the majority of media coverage has obviously not been about that link, it's been about deaths. We're still in that sort of media phase right now. The right people are picking up the right kinds of links, and that again is due to thanks to the work that Amy and others have been doing. It remains just to say what is the process for this regulation going forward. And what is that regulation likely to look like, both of which have semi-vague answers. So the process is very much, the message from the European Commission is that they're upholding the timetable. There'll be a consultation in May, which they will launch, which will be open to all stakeholders to respond to, and I actively encourage all progressive actors to respond to that consultation. There'll be a 10-week time period in which you can respond to it, and do by all means get in touch with me or my colleagues at FERN if you would like to have the link to that consultation once it's open, or be informed of that. So the European Commission is holding that consultation. In parallel, there are 2 reports being written by the European Parliament at the moment, which will be voted on in sort of July to October timetable. It's likely that the European Commission will sort of issue its opening gambit sometime middle of next year, and that in the following years there would then be a process of trilogues between the European Parliament and the European Council in terms of deciding what the ultimate regulation should look like. There are sort of 2 main theories of what this regulation could look like. Well, I guess there are 3. One is more to do with a sort of due diligence type block of solutions, and the other is more to do with sort of labeling and consumer information, which is also could be classified as a regulation. In terms of the due diligence types of regulation, there are 2 main strands. One is a due diligence regulation that would be product based, so very similar to the EU timber regulation, where if a good could not demonstrate that it wasn't linked to habitat conversion or human rights abuses, it wouldn't be allowed on the EU market. The other block of due diligence regulations that are being considered are corporate-based due diligence regulations, more akin to the UK Modern Slavery Act or the French Devoir de Vigilance law. I'm sure in the US you maybe have something similar. in that sense, it's more down to company behavior. So it's not linked directly to the prohibition of the placing of a product on a market, and it's more related to transparency of reporting and of supply chains that companies would issue. I think that's sort of more or less what I wanted to cover. Here are the sources for the information provided in the slide before, and if you have any further questions, then there's my email and my Twitter handle. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Another very informative presentation. We have a lot of good questions coming in. To start, a question for Amy. And again, for those of you, as questions come up, just please put it in the Q&A icon that's directly below the screen. So for Amy, given your knowledge of the nuances of the developing science on the links between deforestation and zoonotic diseases, how should NGOs and other stakeholders position their communications in terms of scientifically accurate messaging on this topic? How would you recommend that framing?
That's a great question, because it is a challenging matter. There's so much heterogeneity in this topic, and each disease is very different in terms of its specifics, and the specifics matter a lot. So taking a page from the climate change world, I think there's a lot of synergy to be had. So for example, we could look at how climate change movements have been successful in moving the needle a little bit in terms of public messaging. In the same vein, I think there are a couple things that have been distilled in the links between deforestation and disease. And those links, like human encroachment leading to zoonoses, vector-borne disease overall increasing, these kinds of things that are rather clear, I think they can be harnessed by NGOs to make a case. But I think it does require a lot of nuance when it gets into the finer details, and those are not to be overlooked. I hope that answers that.
Great. Thank you. We have, wow, a lot of questions coming in, which is great. Question for Glenn, and actually Hannah as well. What can you say around enforcement of corporate and market-based commitments to stop deforestation? What are some of the kind of leverage points, accountability mechanisms, and tools available?
Yeah, well, I'll take it first, but I think this is the great vulnerability of private sector action on forests, is that there's no necessarily legal action to back it up. We do hope that by securing private sector action on forests, we can create political realignments where the companies that once lobbied and bribed governments to weaken environmental protection suddenly have an incentive to make sure that their competitors are subject to the same standards that they themselves have taken on. And they don't want one of their competitors to get an undue advantage, and that should lead them to ask government to actually impose a level playing field across the board. That's happened in some cases. We've had success with that in our work in Africa. Less successful so far in really getting these companies to play that kind of advocacy role in Southeast Asia, but we're continuing to work on it. I think more broadly, the other side of this, though, is that many of these private sector commitments really do work when they are fully enforced. So in 2006, the Brazilian soy moratorium went into place, and within 3 years had cut the rate of deforestation from up to 25% of Amazon deforestation to 0.25%. Is a dramatic decrease, and has stayed at near zero levels for a dozen years. And that was driven by campaigns in Europe and the United States, but also, ultimately by implementation by some of these same companies that I've been talking about as continuing to drive deforestation elsewhere, Cargill, Bunge, et cetera. We saw similar but not quite as comprehensive results from the cattle moratorium in the Brazilian Amazon as well, that contributed to an overall decline in deforestation. So they're very effective, but they need to be monitored. And that was one of the reasons why the Brazilian soy moratorium succeeded, was because of transparent monitoring that NGOs and companies participated in. Similarly, in our work in palm oil, we've set up this rapid response system to monitor the commitments of the palm oil industry. We're very happy that more than 90% of the palm oil industry adopted strong forest and human rights commitments. But in the first years of those commitments, we found widespread violations, and even we found like this company Corindo and another one called Posco that were deforesting 25, 50,000 hectares and still were supplying some of the major traders. But what we found was that when we filed alerts with those companies, they would actually respond quickly. And so we set up this rapid response system, which is on our website, mightyearth.org/rapid response. And because we're doing those monitoring and because these companies have these policies, they're responding. In the cocoa industry, we need more of that kind of monitoring. We tried to set it up ourselves, but we need the industry to take more responsibility. And ultimately, we need the meat companies, soy companies to expand their commitments more broadly. So it's a matter of monitoring, and then also, you must have the citizen accountability. Unless if they backtrack on living up to their commitments, there has to be, there should be campaigns and other means of accountability as well.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that question, which is of course served like on a silver platter, because of course Fern's theory of change in this campaign is very much that, we've had 10 years of commitments and now we need governments to regulate. And then of course the question is, are governments able to enforce their own rules? And Fern will be coming out with a briefing on learning lessons from enforcement of regulations so that we can ensure that we are going upwards and not backwards in terms of improving enforcement. But I would just say one thing, which is that at least half of all deforestation happens in complete illegality. And I think that's also tantamount, it sort of colors the way in which we need to react to that, which is that companies don't have complete control of the supply chains, and that, there are a lot of deforestation also happens because of lack of governance, because of corruption, because of lack of, just poor governance, and hence the need for support to governments like Indonesia and Brazil, etc., to enforce and incentivize them to enforce, but also support them to enforce those regulations that they have domestically, and also support the companies because they can't do it on their own. So I think that's also one reason why we're focusing very much on EU regulation to try and tackle this problem.
Great, thank you. Question for all of you. What types of health-related policies and funding have been tried for reducing deforestation? For example, something similar to the supply chain commitments, but specifically related to tying it to health and public health.
I think policies to protect forests have been motivated by a lot of causes. I mentioned that there's more carbon stored in the world's forests than in all the exploitable fossil fuel reserves. And so that's one motivation. We also are motivated by the desire to protect orangutans and gorillas and chimpanzees and tree kangaroos. And then very much, indigenous peoples are heavily dependent on these forests. And so I think that also has been a big motivator for protecting forests. And it's worth saying in many places, indigenous communities are really the best defenders of forests as well. So I think we've seen in Southeast Asia some modest policies adopted in response to the health impacts of the Haze crisis in 2015 and more recently 2019. The Jokowi administration has taken some actions, like putting forward a ban on additional palm oil concessions. As I said, the sort of peat enforcement has been all over the place, but they have re-wetted a lot of areas and also blocked canals. And a lot of that is motivated by health. But we're also seeing legislative proposals for the so-called omnibus bill that would weaken enforcement at the same time. So I think it's one motivation, but this, just like preventing pandemics, is one of many reasons to protect forests. I think we need to look at it from a holistic perspective, because the need to protect forests will not go away when a vaccine for coronavirus is developed.
I would say that there are quite a lot of EU-based organizations that focus on forests, or that have forest campaigns, that are focusing currently on a piece of regulation called the Farm to Fork strategy, which is going to come out of the EU in the next couple of weeks. It's slightly delayed. And the Farm to Fork strategy is to do with the future of the agricultural system, but it's also to do with the future of the EU food system. And I think that one of the motivations is certainly that a lot of communicable diseases that are related to food consumption, such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, are linked to the consumption of products that are forest risk products, high red meat consumption, high sugar consumption. I would say that it's a sort of latent, it's certainly a growing motivator for organizations working on forests in the EU.
Amy, any insights from your line of work?
I'll just add quickly that, like Hannah just mentioned, that is the best example that I know of where deforestation and meat consumption have been linked policy-wise. The Lancet Eat Commission, for example, is pretty explicit about that, and the mortality risks of eating red meat. However, in terms of infectious diseases, zoonoses, and things like that, there's some NGOs that concern themselves with this matter, but I have not seen any policy myself or anything near it, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Again, so many great questions coming in, and if we are unable to get to all of the questions in this time, then we will do some on social media and as part of the webinar recording Circle Up. Another question is, another initiative happening in 2020 is the CBD, Council for Biological Diversity, is supposed to come up with a new framework for the next decade, as well as the HE targets that are being evaluated. Can you speak to the impacts and influence of these efforts? Or the projected anyway. Not in our area of expertise, I suppose.
Well, Hannah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead. No. I have nothing very, very informed to say about it, other than that the CBD, which is obviously postponed, but when it happens will be obviously a major moment to bring together the climate change and biodiversity impacts of deforestation. But I don't have much more to say than that. Sorry.
Great. Question for Amy. I've read from numerous sources that the rate of emerging infectious diseases, many of which are zoonotic, are increasing over time. They are popping up more now than 50 years ago. Is this true in your view? And if so, how would you characterize or describe that rate of increase?
I do believe that's true, though it's a little bit hampered by detection bias. So we may not have always been looking. Nonetheless, let me just share very briefly one slide that I had from a previous presentation. You can see here that over the decades, there's been a steady rise in the number of emerging infectious disease events. This came out in 2008. And the zoonotic diseases are in panel B right here. So the overall trend is an increase, seen for vector-borne diseases, but also other drug resistance and things like this. So yes, I think that is true, but let's also keep in mind the fact that we've defunded a lot of global surveillance. So coming from our country and internationally, it's always a little hampered in resource limited settings. Here in this country, we've really dialed back the amount of funding. So I think we're not going to be capturing a lot of it moving forward if this continues.
Mm-hmm. Great. Question for all panelists. So there's a narrative that around the tension between development and the assumption that it involves destroying forests is how can one change the model of development that assumes the only way for countries like Brazil to develop is by destroying its forests?
Sure. Well, I think there's loads of data about this, and Brazil is, in some ways a prime example where for about a decade it was able to dramatically reduce the rate of deforestation while doubling agricultural production. One of the main reasons it was able to do that is because in Latin America alone, there are 1.6 billion acres of previously deforested land where you can expand agriculture without threatening pristine ecosystems, where you can, expand soy and cattle without bringing humans into contact with populations of animals to which they have not been exposed to before. And it was really an environmental and economic win-win. And unfortunately, I think for the same reason that like Bolsonaro government and Trump ignore the threat of the coronavirus, they ignore the possibilities for win-win solutions like this, and in some ways have seemed to back off of a lot of the success that Brazil has pioneered, and that's troubling. But those opportunities do exist, and I should say we're also seeing them in Indonesia, where in Southeast Asia, deforestation for palm oil declined from about 1 million acres a year when we and other NGOs started our work in 2012 to fewer than 250,000 acres in the last 2 years. And that's 250,000 acres too many. There's a lot more work to do. But again, this expansion onto degraded lands, improving yields, can meet agricultural goals and still leave plenty of room for forest restoration to boot. And so that's the model that we're focused on promoting.
Great. This might be a little bit out of the scope of what you all are focused on. However, in terms of being experts on global wet markets, however, what effect would a global ban on wet markets have on indigenous forest peoples? And is there evidence that indigenous people who hunt vectors traditionally handle them in better ways or reduce risk of emergence of zoonoses?
I have to say I don't have an answer to that. Maybe Glenn and Amy do, but I think that I think it's not for white organizations to say. I think we would have to ask. There would have to be some sort of consultation, very, very broad, of indigenous peoples representative bodies in order to answer that question.
Amy, I think that was for you.
Very well put, though. I think that it would require such a consultation. I'll just say from my own experience working in Panama, for example, in the rainforest there, it's not wet market per se, but I think it touches on the question. I work with a group of indigenous people who will hunt small mammals in the forest. These folks have a rate of a zoonotic infection called Venezuelan equine encephalitis at a really, really high degree. So 80% will have seroprevalence for this virus. A lot of them will not be really affected over time. But what's so different is that in the other population, the more agricultural population that is neighboring that, they have livestock. They have cattle, they have, importantly, horses. The horses amplify that virus tremendously. And that then gets out of the community into the larger landscape. And affects a huge number of people. So that's what I see as being very different. There's some very complicated dynamics that are occurring in that region, I'll say, but suffice it to say that the small scale at which indigenous people fell animals, essentially, is different from that which you encounter where you have amplifying livestock from agriculturalists. And perhaps the wet markets may also serve as sort of an amplifying vector. And as such, well, there should be probably a lot more that we should look into in that regard.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think it's one thing to talk about, indigenous people's traditional hunting, and entirely another to talk about a wet market hundreds of miles away from the forest in a city, or even thousands of miles away, where you're taking wildlife exploited, hunted in Southeast Asia to China, or another part of Southeast Asia. That kind of market pressure is unsustainable for wildlife populations and is a spreader of disease. And so, we and many others have joined global calls from public health authorities, including the CDC here, for eliminating that kind of wildlife trafficking and trade. And so we see that as quite different from sort of traditional exploitation.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a lot more questions that I wish we could get to, but unfortunately we are up against the hour, and I know everyone has busy days. So I just want to give speakers a moment if they have any final comments that they would like to make. And for those of you who still have questions or want to see the recording, or just want to be in touch with our speakers, you can follow us at Stand Mighty. You can also contact me, Lucia, Lucia, at mightyearth.org. And you can just go to our website, ask questions, and we will direct them to the speakers. This recording will be available online afterwards. And we encourage you to share it with anyone that you think might benefit from having a greater understanding between this link, how to communicate, seeking scientific information, or looking for stories around the emerging opportunities in 2020 to make sure that those commitments and that ambition is not lost and continues forward as part of the portfolio of solutions that we urgently need for both mitigating the harm of the current pandemic, but also protecting against future pandemics. So does anyone on our panel have any closing thoughts?
I'm going to defer to Amy because I think we're very lucky to have her unique perspective here, particularly for this audience, which I presume is largely from an environmental background. So I know there's a number of questions that are really honing in on her expertise. So I'll give my time over to Amy.
Ditto.
Goodness, well, thank you all so much. It's really quite a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. I think that the mounting evidence, research evidence so far, hopefully will percolate into cultural change and the kind of change that you guys all enact. So I really thank you for your efforts. And to briefly answer a question that is very relevant to today and what we're all facing with regards to the intersection between COVID and fire impacts on health. I'll just say 1 minute's worth because I don't know more than that. What has been shown previously anyway is that air pollutants and fire have indeed impacted rates of pneumonia due to other causes, viral and bacterial. And so there's every reason to believe that there will be indeed an interaction between air pollutants, haze, fire, and severity of COVID as well. I think that remains to be seen fully though. There will hopefully be groups researching this and looking into this and quantifying it. But again, going back to the policy piece, that's what you all do. And I really, really thank you for that. I feel oftentimes like I'm operating some obscure realm with unknown significance. And so to come into contact with you all just really invigorates me. Thank you. I'm sure you others have much to contribute. So I'll leave a minute to you.
Likewise, thank you so much. And for those of you, we had almost 350 people register for today's webinar. So that goes to show that there is broad interest in linking health and the environment and seeing ongoing action in 2020. So with that, thank you to everybody, and we look forward to hearing from all you soon.
Great, thank you. We'll try to answer the other questions, but thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.